Hello class, welcome to week 6 of Experience Design 1. Today we're going to talk about information architecture, what it is, and user flows and what that is. Information architecture. I think I've said this before in the class, but this is a good quote for it. Good design, when it's done well, becomes invisible. It's only when it's done poorly that we notice it. Now, this applies to everything in this course, not just information architecture, but I thought it'd be good to just kind of remind you that that good design is indeed invisible and that you only tend to notice things that don't work well. When information is organized well, it becomes invisible. This removes cognitive load. So what is information architecture? Information architecture focuses on organizing, structuring, and labeling content in an effective and sustainable way. The goal is to help users find information and complete tasks. So this is pretty general description. Let's break it down a little bit. Information architecture is the first step in designing a user experience. In this step, you organize information in an intuitive and easy to access fashion. This is particularly important in complex and information-heavy sites. So, information architecture can be thought of ways of categorizing information, putting information into buckets. By buckets, in terms of a web page, what I mean is like the top level nav. You're probably used to seeing top level navs on websites. They usually contain things like, about, portfolio, careers, stuff like that. Contact us is usually on there. So you're quite familiar with that. So in some ways have an intuitive understanding of what needs to be on the top level. Sometimes, though, it's more difficult than that. But we can talk about that in a little bit. The main components of AI, which is the short form of information architecture, is organizing schemes and structures, how you categorize and structure information. That's how you group information together. That's sometimes a little bit harder than you think because sometimes when you're working with a site for a client that has a lot of information, things don't naturally group so well, or there might be two categories they group into equally as well. And that's when it becomes more challenging and more difficult. Labeling systems, how you represent information, so what you call the bucket that you've put all this information into. Navigation systems, that's how do you find the information on the site once you get there, or the app. Search systems, how users look for information. And so this is like if there's a search functionality on the site, how does the search work? There's many different ways. It could be searches could just match against the text on the page, or it can match against keywords or tags. Sometimes that's more effective if the content is tagged effectively. So information architecture is like the start of the process of designing a user experience. It's usually for a larger site or a site that has lots of information on it. And the challenge is to kind of take the information and put it into a navigation structure that makes it easy to find. Nowadays, a lot of times when we're doing a site, we're not building a site from scratch, we're rebuilding an existing site. And the interesting thing that happens with existing sites, especially if they have a CMS, which is a content management system, you have users that are creating new content for the site, and they tend to be not so rigorous in terms of how they're uploading information. So you might inherit a site, and it might just have all kinds of stuff spread all over the site in sort of a hodgepodge. And then your job is to kind of identify all that content and put it back into buckets that make sense. We did some work for the Ontario College of Teachers where we identified that. They still haven't done the work of rebuilding the site, but they have a CMS system and there's a ton of information and some of it's buried like 5 or 6 levels deep, which is functionally to most users invisible. They won't ever find it. So what does an information architecture look like? Well, an information architecture is a symbolic representation of the site. It isn't a design of the actual pages itself. Usually each page is represented by like a box with a label in it. You can see here, this is a relatively simple information architecture. This is one is for an account section of a website. You can see that, after you click on account, you get, 4 options: my calendars, my account, subscriptions, my contacts, log out. And inside my account, you have a secondary level that has email, password, address. And then there's a phase two section indicated there as well. So you can see here, this is just like kind of a symbolic representation of the content of the site and how it links together in a structural sort of way. The lines kind of indicate the levels of the content and how you have to go through the pages to get to the content you're looking for. And like I said, this is very, very simple. Information architecture, especially for for a small site, like maybe for a restaurant site, it wouldn't be much larger than this, right? You identify, about, menu, uh, careers, possibly contact, and you've got pretty much all the content for the site. Um, Sites, however, can be quite large, and the information architecture can get quite complicated. This is a medium complex one. I've dealt with sites that are 10 times the complexity of this. So this is the step you do to kind of categorize the information before you start doing wireframes. Um, for the wireframes, you kind of have to know where everything's going to go. You can't really do the wireframes until you have a sense of that. So this is like the first step. And actually, when I first started in web design, it wasn't called user experience design. It was called information architecture. That's what, and the information architects did wireframes as well. As I've said in the past, the job titles for experience designer can vary. So you could have somebody that's just an information architect, and they would be responsible for creating this. But in a smaller company, that would be in a large company, but in a smaller company, you probably have an experienced designer that does information architecture, wireframes, interaction design, the whole thing from start to finish. Um, but yeah, when I said, when I first started, the information architects were the ones that were doing user experience design. It was only later that the concept of user experience design became accepted as a thing to itself. So basically, IA is putting website content into buckets, which is the buckets are navigation, and labeling those buckets to make it easier for users to navigate the site. For some things there's already a well-established precedent, and we know intuitively where it should go. For example, change your password. We know this usually is in the account section of a website. But some content may be difficult to categorize. For example, research papers. Where would this live? Would it be buried under company information, or would it be featured on the top level navigation? I can't answer that. It very much this would depend on the company and how important those research papers are. If it is some large software development firm, the research papers might be so important that it is a top level navigation item. For another company, it might be that it's a secondary thing they do, and it would be buried under company information or something like that. So it really depends on the client and who they are and what they're trying to do, what they're trying to communicate, and how important this content is for them, for the public, the users to see it. So I've mentioned these terms like buried and top level. What practically do I mean by that? Um, so on Instagram, if you hit the little hamburger menu, this pops up. This would be considered the top level of Instagram. It's got settings, archive, insights, your activity, QR code saved, close friends, discover people. Now I have a bit of a problem with the Instagram navigation, and we'll go into that a little bit because this will show you really what information architecture is and what happens when it doesn't work out very well. So this is the top level nav on the mobile site. On the desktop site, you can see here I have outlined in red the top level nav on the desktop site. It's surprisingly different, and it's kind of interesting that it's only indicated by icons and no text. Maybe if you're familiar enough with Instagram, it all makes sense. Like the paper airplane is messages. Um, I think the compass is like your history. Heart is what you've liked and what your friends have liked. Um, I don't like seeing inconsistency between the the mobile version of the site and the desktop. You could argue that this sub menu is not the top level menu because you'll know that you can get messages and stuff like that in the main interface itself. So there's a point there, but still there's a radical inconsistency between mobile and desktop. Now, changing your password on a website or an app should be a very easy process. I found that where Instagram puts it, it's it's not in the most logical place. Because I just mentioned that usually change your password is in the account section. This is not true in Instagram. In Instagram, you have to hit the hamburger menu, you have to hit settings, and then it's not account, which is on there, which is my first mistake. I went to account intuitively, but it's under security, which makes sense. You know, changing your password does make sense under security. Uh, but I think what I would have done is I would have put an account on the first screen and then had security inside account. I think that would have made me understand what that means better. But yeah, currently what you do is hit settings, security, and then password. So, I would have, if I was the information architect on this, I would have put account on the top level, not buried under settings. And I would have had security as a sub level inside of that. Now, it still would have taken you almost as many clicks, but to me, that makes more intuitive sense for a user. So that's just like a small example of how information architecture works and how it's applied in a real world example. Okay, so let's go on to user flows. What's a user flow? A user flow is a path taken by a prototypical user on a website or app to complete a task. The user flow takes them from their entry point through a series of steps towards a successful outcome and final action, such as purchasing a product. So user flows are similar to information architecture in that they're abstract usually. They use boxes to indicate steps, and the steps on the website you may have one page, but there might be 3 steps on one page. So the information architecture, those blocks indicate categories. Here they indicate actions rather than pages, which I found from past experience in this class that that's something that the students struggle with. An assignment for last year's class was to create a user flow, and I don't think anybody really got this right because it's very abstract and I think it's something you have to do a few times before you can get a sense of how to best represent the user flow, because what you're trying to do is communicate to the person looking at the document what the user flow is. But before I launch into that, let me just show you what a basic user flow is. So here you have one, and you can see that it lists the steps and the decision points. Decision points are indicated oftentimes by a triangle. So you choose yes or no, and it shows the different flow you'd experience if you made that choice. Now, one thing I should point out that user flows can get crazy complicated. And so usually you do a user flow for one path or task through the site. You don't try to do the whole, if you try to do the whole website, it would be a gigantic noodly mess of stuff and nobody would be able to understand it. One of the important things about this course is whatever you present should be understandable, very, very simply. Like even like if you handed in a user flow to me, I should be able to look at it and get exactly what's going on instantaneously. This one's pretty straightforward and breaks everything down. But the thing you'll notice is that, that first section there is the login or sign up. That all happens like in one section, maybe 1 or 2 pages. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 6 different kind of boxes in there. So those boxes don't necessarily map to a page. They map to choices and decisions and things you do, possibly on one page or possibly multiple pages. So that's the thing that made it hard for students to understand. And so, like I said, user flows can get complicated very quickly. So that one I showed you is a very basic one. Here is like one of medium, well, maybe high complexity. So you can see that quite quickly for any kind of application that maybe has like 3 or 4 steps, it can start to, the complexity and the branching trees of decisions can get out of hand very, very quickly. And I don't know about you, but I find that very difficult to read. I'd have to sit down and like really look at it to kind of figure out what it means. So, I found it's better if you're going to do a user flow just to do one for each very specific task. And then you can kind of understand what happens. Traditionally, what we do is do user flows and then indicate with like a number, a wireframe that's associated with it. So you can look at the wireframe and then look at the user flow. That being said, it's still a bit clunky. It's clunky. So we'll talk about that in a sec. User flows are very helpful for explaining functionality to programmers and for finding any holes in the user experience. So by doing this, it's so methodical that you can see where you're missing something. But in my experience, user flows are very difficult for clients to understand because they are abstract representations of how you interact with the site and not representational. Many clients have trouble understanding how the user flow works with the design of the site. So not only do students like yourselves have trouble creating user flows, it's almost impossible for clients to really understand them. And if we're building these, it's one thing to be building it for a programmer, they'll understand it. But if we're building these for approval for a user flow from a client, we may be doing ourselves a disservice for doing it in a traditional way. So one way to bridge this gap is sort of a relatively new way of doing this, and they're called wire flows. And what they do is they combine wireframes and the user flow experience together. I find this a lot more useful because the client can actually see the page and see how the decisions stem from those pages. So here, I'll just show you quickly a wire flow. So you can see here with this wire flow, it actually shows like the phone, and it shows the wireframe content of the website. Now, wireframe content, we'll talk about this more at a later date, but wireframes are basically the blueprints of a website without any design. So they indicate where buttons are and what things are labeled and what kind of functionality goes on, but they're not really design documents in terms of finished graphic design. In here, you can see there's enough design so that you understand what's going on. But the great thing is that, instead of the little weird boxes that indicate sort of conceptual moments of decision, you can see how on the site itself you make these choices and when it changes from one page to another page. So, this is very useful. It's also very time consuming to make these. These are very difficult. There are some new tools out there that help you, that make it a bit easier. But still, it's very time consuming, but very useful. It's much easier to get client approval with a wire flow than a user flow. Here's another one. They're all done different ways too. Every information architect, every user experience designer has a different way of doing it, and you should be the same way. You should find what's comfortable for you, as long as it's understandable. It's fine. There's no like one right way to do it. You can see here that this designer used those diamond shaped boxes to indicate choice, whereas in this previous one, it's just lines going from points of input to output. And now, after spending all that time talking about user flows, I want to say that while I think that wire flows are better than traditional user flows, I think that an even better solution is to create clickable wireframes or a prototype. This allows clients and programmers to see the application in action in a way that is very close to the final product. I have found this super useful. You basically create a wireframe of the website that's clickable. They can click on the buttons and it looks like it's going between pages. And you can actually see, right in front of your face, how it's all working. This is much easier for clients to understand. In many ways, much easier to build than trying to build a traditional user flow, or especially a wire flow. You can make clickable prototypes in a number of different applications these days. Adobe XD, which I believe you all have, is you can use that, and it's super easy. Dare I say, even fun to create them. It allows you to create pretty sophisticated prototypes, which allow you to like put them in front of users and get real feedback as well. So there's, you throw a user flow in front of a regular user, they're not going to know what they're looking at. But you throw, a wireframe of a site that's clickable and you can move through it in front of them. They can comment. They can go, oh, this step didn't make sense, or this took too many clicks, et cetera, et cetera. So there's some other programs that do it as well. There's a whole ton out there, but some of the big ones are Sketch, which was kind of what XD based their application on. It's Mac only though. InVision, which is a website that lets you do it, create clickable prototypes. InVision's been around for a very long time. And there's Figma, which is a relatively new web-based, cloud-based tool for doing user experience and information architecture. People really love it. I haven't used Figma a lot, but people really love it. So those are a few of the potential applications you can use to make a clickable prototype. But don't get too worried about that. We're going to cover clickable prototypes in an upcoming class because I would love for you guys to do your final wireframes as clickable prototypes. All right, and that brings us to taco time. So thank you very much for your time and your patience and your attention. I hope this all made sense, and I hope you have a lovely week. Talk to you soon.